This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on the 27th of September 2025. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday. Coming up on today's programme, we'll have a look through the week's news and culture with international journalist and founder of China Dialogue, Isabel Hilton. Then we'll hear how the Open Society Fellowship is helping artists and thinkers shape global conversations on today's most urgent social, cultural and environmental issues. That's all ahead here on Monocle on Saturday. First, though, the news. The US says it will revoke Colombian President Gustavo Petro's visa after he joined a pro-Palestinian protest in New York and urged American soldiers to defy Donald Trump's orders. Petro, already a fierce critic of Israel's war in Gaza, accused the US of complicity in genocide during his UN speech, deepening a sharp rift with Washington. US congressional Democrats have released daily schedules belonging to the late financier and sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, which show Epstein had plans to meet with Republican donors Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and conservative commentator Steve Bannon. The documents also showed Britain's Prince Andrew flew on Epstein's private jet. And Turkey has withdrawn its bid to impose EU-wide rules on how a doner kebab should be made, after a clash with Germany's powerful kebab industry. The proposed restrictions on meat cuts, marinades and even knives has skewered Berlin's version of the dish, which many now see as part of Germany's own national cuisine. And that's your Monocle Radio News. Hello and welcome to Monocle on Saturday. I'm joined now in the studio by Isabel Hilton, who's an international journalist, the founder of China Dialogue. And might I ask, are you also a fan of doner kebabs?
Actually, not terribly, but I was quite impressed by the idea that this was powerful and don't go up against Big Donor.
Or, in fact, Big Donald, which is what we're talking about today. So, The Guardian, the letter from the editor today, from the editor-in-chief, Catherine Viner, says it's another week in which the columnist Jonathan Friedland put it, the march towards darkness is becoming a sprint. And she just goes through all the madness coming out of Washington this week, and indeed New York, where, of course, Donald Trump made so many misleading and false statements, she says, in his address to the UN, that she said our fact check had to focus on only the most egregious of his claims. They couldn't really go into everything. There was his attack on Tylenol, or paracetamol as we call it here. Really this whole look at the way that women are being stigmatised, that so many rights have been taken away from women, and just how nobody is challenging this. The Guardian also has a great piece going more into the indictment of James Comey, and of course Comey himself gave a fabulous response. Just talk us through how we've come to this with Comey.
Well, Comey, you will recall, was the director of the FBI, and he led the investigation into the relationship between Trump's first presidential campaign and Russia. Which actually was admitted by, amongst others, Trump himself and one of his sons. So there clearly was a relationship. He led the investigation. That was his job. There was subsequently a congressional hearing into that investigation. And he is now accused of lying to that congressional hearing, which is a serious offence. How we got to the point where a former FBI director was being prosecuted by a sitting president, effectively, is that really, the two fell out. Trump has a long list of grievances and enemies. And he said in his last presidential campaign that, he was the vengeance. He was going to take revenge on anyone who had crossed him. And given his personality, that is almost everyone who's ever worked with him, certainly in the first administration. So he has ordered the Justice Department to indict people he doesn't like. Now, there is still some integrity left in the legal system in the United States, people who care about the Constitution and the extreme importance of separation of powers, and people who refuse to indulge the president by simply locking up people he dislikes at will, and they get fired. So his capacity to fire prosecutors who look at the evidence, find there isn't any, and won't prosecute is key to this. So he has now put one of his former personal lawyers, a woman called Lindsay Halligan, in charge of this case.
Who's never been a prosecutor.
She has never been a prosecutor. She has no prosecutorial experience, but she's happy to do what Donald Trump wants. So he is now indicted. And they have made it absolutely clear that this is only the beginning. Endless statements last week about it's going to get very difficult for Democrats. Watch out, all you people who have dared to cross Donald Trump. So it's a pretty extraordinary moment.
Tell us about Comey's response, because it was very measured and really very sensible.
It was very dignified, actually, and he talked about how he and his family had understood for many years that it was very dangerous to cross Donald Trump. But essentially, he said, I'm not afraid, and you shouldn't be either. And he came out with this extraordinary phrase, we won't live on our knees, and you shouldn't either. And that was just a statement of sort of dignity and principle, which, compared to the rhetoric from the other side, was both brave and principled and very convincing.
So this week we're looking at the possible shutdown of the government.
Yes, and that is because of the big, beautiful bill. Remember that one? So the Democrats don't want to endorse this bill. The Republicans are saying, well, the government will shut down if you don't pass the bill. And I think the last time I checked, it was also the case that the Republicans were trying not to have a vote on it in case they lost. So essentially, they're cancelling, business, and we are heading towards a moment where, again, the federal government might shut down. There are suggestions that will be the excuse for the administration simply to fire a lot of people, a kind of rerun of the disastrous Musk episode in which, people get fired indiscriminately. And the sense of kind of turmoil building in the United States is really quite extraordinary. Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, has summoned several hundred senior military officers from posts all over the world to Washington next week. Nobody knows what the purpose of this is, but again, the suggestion is that he might want to do a wholesale firing of people who won't take an oath of personal loyalty to Trump as opposed to the Constitution. So there's a sense of kind of gathering an escalating kind of set of moves by Trump, none of which are really bode any good.
No, none whatsoever. And just back to this whole government shutdown, it would appear, and certainly some analysts are suggesting, that this is actually what the Republicans want, or at least what Trump wants. He cancelled meetings with senior Democrats this week, and so he doesn't even want to talk to them. It looks like that this is something he needs to happen because, as you say, he can then fire a lot of people. I wonder if this is also because he'd quite like to announce a state of emergency, which of course would give him absolute power.
Well, I have long suspected that would be part of the end game. I felt for a long time it was highly unlikely, for example, that we would have midterm elections because he might lose. And these people do not want to lose power. So the only way to guarantee you don't lose power is to create a situation, declare a state of emergency and suspend the elections. And we've seen rehearsals for this. The idea that Venezuela was invading the United States, therefore emergency powers, were justified, was complete nonsense. It's like, sinking ships in the Caribbean. It's nonsense. So he is grossly abusing his command of the military to provoke situations, to escalate situations, which would then further justify his crackdown. And all his rhetoric, right from the beginning, has been that the United States is in under threat. It's a disaster. We have to take extreme. We must act before we lose our country. All this kind of nonsense has been ramped up, and he is provoking the crises, which, as you suggest, will then give him further excuse to take dictatorial powers.
And on top of this, of course, came the murder of Charlie Kirk, and then that extraordinary memorial that we saw for him, which I think is just entrenching more this idea that America is a Christian society, where indeed the Constitution says that, the founding fathers made it clear that this must never happen.
Indeed, and it was meant to be a separation of religious belief and state. Excuse me. And frankly, the idea that Donald Trump is an exemplar of Christianity is pretty hard to take. And there was a very marked distinction between the rather dignified behaviour of Charlie Kirk's widow, who you will recall is a practicing Christian, and said she forgave the young man who'd killed her husband, and Trump, who came on and said, well, I don't forgive anybody. I want everybody to suffer. So, even then, at a moment when you might have thought he would at least pretend to have read the New Testament, he didn't seem to have.
Isabel, this is all blindingly obvious to you and me, and I'm sure that many, many, many Americans too. I mean, this is not that they haven't realised this is going on. Why aren't they speaking out? I mean, many people are. I get that, but why are the grown-ups in the Republican Party still insisting that the emperor is fully clothed?
No, the grown-ups in the Republican Party have a serious responsibility here, because they are enabling him, and they are, I guess, afraid of losing their seats. We have seen a purge of old school Republicans who opposed him. Some didn't run in the last election. Some had been so bruised the first time, or some were threatened with being defunded. This is an operation that now commands a huge amount of money and a huge amount of power. And I think that a lot of Americans just had a faith in the checks and balances. And it turns out that the checks and balances rely rather too heavily on everybody acting within the norms. And if you're prepared to act completely beyond the norms, there isn't very much to stop you. And I think it's going to be very interesting, for example, if Donald Trump does try to deploy the military at home to suppress dissent and to uphold a dictatorship, what will the military do? They've all taken an oath, as I say, to the Constitution, not to the president. Will we see military figures, senior military figures, saying, no, that's not my job, or this is against my oath? So there are lots of potential conflicts to come. We do see politicians. The Democrats have been a bit of a mess since the election, but Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has been pretty outspoken. I mean, you're beginning to see individuals resisting. But I also think that the bulk of Americans, who have, after all, lived in a relatively stable republic most of their lives, essentially believed that if they could just get through the next 2 years, it would self-correct. And I think it's a big acknowledgement that it might not self-correct. And then what do? They have no experience of resisting dictatorships. They haven't lived in dictatorships. I think, those of us who have looked at dictatorships and reported from dictatorships were probably rather quicker to recognise what was happening than people who have lived in the Republic and had faith in the Republic.
And I mean, on an individual level, I can see why it's very difficult to fight back, because, of course, he just goes after you personally. But if there was concerted action, if all of those senior Republicans got together and as one, or indeed the military, as you say, then there would be a real chance of doing it.
Well, yes, there would. Well, I guess we just have to hope that one day they wake up and say this can't go on, and take action. But the other characteristic of this particular operation is that they fire the competent and honest people, and they put in place people who would never have these jobs normally. So they owe everything to Donald Trump, and they know that they can be fired for the slightest act of loyalty. So we have these, grotesque cabinet meetings, which are just, I mean, honestly, it would make a North Korean blush to listen to the sort of praise that the people around that table have to heap on Donald Trump. It's just extraordinary.
Now, it's not that nobody's doing anything, because there are many, many organisations that are trying to fight back under very, very difficult circumstances. And one of those is Open Society. So now, Isabel, I know that you were on the advisory board when the fellowship, the Open Society Fellowship, started. So I'd like to bring in Stephen Hubble, who's director of the fellowship. I understand you're old friends. Stephen, hello.
Hello, Georgina. Hello, Isabel.
Hello, Stephen. How very nice. What a lovely surprise on a Saturday morning.
How great to see you. I can't see you, but I...
Stephen, tell us, Open Society has relaunched the Open Society Fellowship, and this year supporting 31 changemakers from across the global south who are using their work to tackle urgent issues. Just tell us a little bit more about this. Firstly, why is it necessary?
Well, sure. The Open Society Fellowship has been around, as Isabel knows, since 2008. The big changes that we introduced last year were to limit our recruitment to 7 global cities of the global south. These are places that are dynamic hubs of idea exchange, of intellectual creativity, and we're focusing only on what we call public intellectuals. These are practitioners from any number of groups: journalists, academics, artists, museum curators, playwrights, etc., who have the ability to communicate complex, sophisticated, critical ideas to a broad audience. So it builds on the success of the fellowship that Isabel knows so well, but with some new elements introduced.
Right. Isabel, when you were on the advisory board, what was your aim there?
Well, the aim was it was similar. It was to find people who had good, challenging ideas, excuse me, including ideas that would challenge the work of the foundations itself, because the foundation was very keen that it not lapse into kind of, complacency or bureaucracy. So it wanted outsiders to be empowered to enter into a kind of spirited conversation on what the foundation itself was doing, but also, again, on the problems that perhaps the foundation, excuse me, wasn't thinking about quite as much as it should. And it was a very wonderful experience, because, of course, all these ideas and propositions came before the advisory board, and we all had a very stimulating time. And it did wonders for both for the individuals who won the fellowships, but also for the wider world of ideas.
So, Stephen, I wonder if you could give us some examples of the 2025-26 fellows.
Obviously, we have the highest regard for all our fellows equally. So, but a few jump to mind as being they're all exceptional. But I think of Madonna Adib, who is a Syrian playwright, a Syrian filmmaker currently living in Beirut, which is one of our 7 cities. Her project looks at queer lives in Syria since the Assad dictatorship. When she became a fellow, the dictatorship was still very much in place, and it was expected to be something of a samizdat project. Since then, obviously, the landscape has changed completely. She's an absolutely brilliant, subtle filmmaker, accomplished well beyond her years. She's going to be a name that we recognize universally or very widely in the next couple of years once she finishes her current project. And she has a couple of other short films circulating on the international film circuit now. So Madonna is definitely somebody to keep an eye out for.
Mm-hmm. And you've got representatives in Lagos, in Jakarta, in Colombo, and so on too.
That's right. The other cities are Taipei, Buenos Aires, Dar es Salaam, and I think that adds up to 7.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Stephen, the Open Society obviously funded by George Soros, and we've just been talking about Donald Trump and how much he is threatening the very nature of democracy. Is the Soros Foundation under threat?
I mean, it's hard not to imagine that we're all under threat to some degree. I mean, the antidote to what's going on now in the U.S. and in some other countries is greater freedom to speak, to express oneself. The Open Society Foundations has always been on the side of those who support the freedom to speak, even of those we disagree with. So that may be the biggest difference between what the Open Society Foundations and some of its adversaries believe, is that we stand steadfast in favor of the freedoms of those who stand on the polar opposite side of all the important issues of the day, to express themselves freely and without government sanction.
So, Can these representatives from the global south make any meaningful intervention in what's going on in the West?
Well, I mean, that is the idea, that these are people from places where the ideas, where their contributions are not received or not heard to the extent that they deserve to be. We hope, in our modest way, to elevate these people and their voices to the global conversation where they belong. They're people of incredible resourcefulness and talent. It's only a matter of time, really, before they take their rightful place in those global conversations. But it is an explicit purpose of this program to decenter the conversation, to make sure that it's not just voices from London or New York or Washington or Berlin, the main capitals of the U.S., Europe, who are heard. I think we all benefit when voices from places like the seven cities are amplified and given the space that they deserve.
Stephen, I think this is such an imaginative development of the fellowship. Congratulations, and I can't wait to get better acquainted with your current crop of fellows. And I couldn't agree more that actually learning from that experience, even for the United States at this moment, could be extremely helpful and useful.
Totally agreed, Isabel. That's just exactly our thinking, and it's all about cross-pollination. It's all about, as you said earlier, understanding that even our best laid plans may be misbegotten in some way. Yes. That it's always healthy to introduce opinions, including those that may contradict us.
I like to sum that up with defending the freedom of the right of someone to be wrong about everything.
Exactly.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. And that from the Open Society, that was Stephen Hubble. Just going back to what we were talking about, Isabel, we mentioned, of course, the completely insane speech at the United Nations that Donald Trump gave. And of course, there have been a lot of headlines coming out of UNGA, or as Tom Edwards called it, the UNGA Games.
Very good.
And one of them was China setting a goal to slash greenhouse gases from peak levels.
Slash might be slightly overstating it, if I may say so. We gently reduce. I mean, look, it's significant. Xi Jinping didn't turn up in person, which was noted. However, he did make a video speech in which China set a hard target for the first time. It's just that the target was a little bit disappointing. For it was, promising to reduce China's greenhouse gases by around 7% from its peak. A couple of problems. The discussion before this announcement had really been around whether China would promise 15 or maybe 18%, so it's considerably less. But also they haven't actually said when the peak was. So it's 7% of what exactly? We don't know. Whatever, it's not, although it's, any progress is welcome, and particularly in the light of the President of the United States' remarks on climate change being a hoax. Of course, it's very welcome that China has set this target, but the fact is that this is not at all compliant with the goals everyone agreed to in the Paris Agreement to keep average global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. We've pretty much bust that, actually, already. And the worry is how much further it will go.
Now, as you say, Xi Jinping was not there. Another leader that wasn't there was Emerson Mnangagwa, who is the president of Zimbabwe. And he said that he had pressing commitments at home. Well, Zimbabwe watchers will know that that's because he is being challenged by his VP, General Chiwenga. And I think is just simply too frightened to leave the country at the moment in case there's a coup. And there are a lot of people in Zimbabwe who think that that's about to happen. Meanwhile, I understand that Zimbabwe's launched a Security Council bid at the United Nations General Assembly. So be very interesting to see that. They've launched a candidature campaign for a non-permanent representation in the UN Security Council for the period 2027-28. And the Foreign Affairs and International Trade Minister had to do this on behalf of the president because, of course, the president has so many security worries of his own that he wasn't able to be there. So good luck with that. Now, let's have another look at a China story because the Premier has announced that China will no longer claim the benefits available to developing nations at the World Trade Organization. Why is that?
Well, that's a curious one. I mean, this has been a source of some complaint for some time because China is, as you know, the second biggest economy in the world. And China has been sort of swithering between, being the biggest thing in the playground, and then it's sort of you turn around and it's, oh, poor little me, I'm just a developing country. Being a developing country in the WTO does give you lots of privileges, but it's become harder and harder to sustain. China's average GDP per capita is way beyond developing country status and is nudging rich country status. So it was becoming less and less plausible that China could hang on to it. My suspicion about the timing of this announcement is that, of course, the US and China are back talking about trade, after the kind of great tariff fight. We have seen several rounds of talks. China has certainly shown muscle in these discussions because it has a monopoly of things, the production of items that the US needs, like rare earths and critical minerals and so on. So the negotiations are quite tough. And I think that this was particularly something that the Americans would have brought up, this kind of you're cheating on the rules in the WTO. So they're removing that. Perhaps they don't need it anymore. Perhaps they understand that it's just bad for China's image as a rising, responsible global power to be seen to be bending the rules quite so much in its favour.
Finally, I want to look at a story about a high school in Kentucky that's banned phones. What happened?
Well, that's a very, very lovely story. It's a high school in Louisville. Apparently in Kentucky, you're not allowed to use phones actually in the classroom, but this particular high school banned them as they said, from bell to bell, so from beginning of the day to the end of the day. And they discovered that the most extraordinary rush to the library. So instead of being on their phones, they found that students were taking out 67% more books than in the month before the phones were banned. And the librarians say they're talking about books, they're not just reading them, but their whole kind of focus and concentration has improved. Now, we sort of knew this happened, but it's always extraordinary to see the immediate effect.
I mean, this sort of takes us back to where we began and talking about the sort of clampdown on freedom of expression and so on in the United States, because there was this list of 850 books to be banned, mostly about either people of colour or people of different sexual orientation. And there's a wonderful film that's been made called The Librarians, and we ran an interview with the director of the film. I spoke to her last week on the briefing, and she had got all these librarians together who were talking about how they were fighting back, but of course they're just being fired too. So I mean,
actually, I remember in Trump 1, in the first presidency, the librarians were a source of resistance then. I think, don't don't meddle with big book either. I would back the librarians of America against, quite a lot of hostile force.
Yeah, some very formidable women there, and really just fighting for right. And just to point you to that interview on the briefing, but also to point you to Meet the Writers, because the current episode is with Michael Wolff, who, of course, has written several books about Donald Trump, and his latest one is called All or Nothing. And he is my guest on Meet the Writers this week, and he has spoken extensively about Trump. I asked him if Donald Trump was intelligent, and he said, no, he's a fucking moron. I'm sorry about my language, but it was his direct quote. And so that's an interview that listeners might want to find wherever they get their podcasts. Isabel, thank you very much indeed for being my guest today. It's such a bleak time, but you bring joy and lightness to our conversation.
Always a pleasure, Georgina.
That's all for Monocle on Saturday. Thanks, Isabel, also to Stephen Hubble, and to our producer and studio engineer, Mariella Bevan. Monocle on Saturday returns next weekend. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.